Hello YouTube. I felt motivated to make a video response to this newly released feminist freak video on body language and the male gaze. This latest video feels almost identical to its predecessor, Strategic Butt Coverings, in that Anita argues that the camera focuses on women's asses, the women are dressed and animated hypersexually, that this is a choice made by game developers to sell fat material to 14-year-old boys, and she rehashes that the solution isn't to simply sexualize male characters who are already sexualized. The only thing she really adds to this video is a quote from an author. Now, before I get started, I really want to stress not to send Anita and her ilk any hatred. I'm of the opinion that she's coming from a good place even though she is thoroughly wrong. She doesn't deserve threats or aggressive language, just reasoned disagreement. So please, don't be one of those assholes. Anyway, let's get into it.
Movement can be a powerful thing. Most of us who play games can appreciate the importance of a well-timed jump in a platformer or a skillful dodge in a fighting game.
And we appreciate these things because we admire the skill of the player doing them. The animations involved can add a wow factor, but are otherwise not important.
But sometimes it's the seemingly ordinary movements that actually tell us the most about a character. The way they do simple things like walk or sit down. And like anything else about a character, movement can be used in ways that resist tired gender stereotypes or in ways that reinforce them.
So I'm going to let your false equivalency slide here for a minute and call out what the real problem here is. You don't play a game to have fun or to challenge yourself. Your primary concern when sitting down to play a game is, what does this game tell me about the avatar and the supporting cast? You ascribe to say that the characteristics of women in games reinforce common female traits, and this is somehow harmful. You have no statistical data to back this up. You can't find a single trend or negative result that is on the rise and suggests that women are actually being harmed from this. And you know what you never ask? You never ask, is the game fun? And can you ascribe a sense of self-worth from your accomplishments when playing it? Because these are ultimately positive things. And it's because you got your stupid feminist lens on that you can't derive any fun or sense of self-worth from playing a video game. Sorry, back to the program.
In Bungie's hugely successful online shooter Destiny, players start by creating their own character, a guardian who will fight to protect the last remnants of humanity. As with character creation tools in other games, this one lets you choose from different genders and races.
The way she described it, it's like this technology hasn't been around since, 1998?
In most ways, Destiny treats its playable female characters almost identically to how it treats its male characters. For instance, the armor you acquire when playing as a female character isn't sexualized, but looks just as practical and stylish as the gear equipped by male characters.
Oh boy. And here we're about to prove the axiom that it doesn't matter what you do, Anita will find some way to complain about it.
However, there is one way in which the male and female characters are differentiated by gender, and it has to do with their movement. Watch how a male guardian sits down, taking a load off after a long, hard day fighting the forces of pure evil.
Oh, hang on. Let me put on my feminist lens for a second here. Hey, wait a minute. That guy's man-spreading. And here's the thing. If a woman took this same pose on, she'd be complaining that the camera was pointed right at the crotch.
It's simple. It suggests confidence. When a female character sits down, however, it's a completely different story. She sits like a delicate flower. This is supposed to be a hardened space warrior, and yet she's sitting around like she's Ariel from The Little Mermaid.
Oh, look at you. You're so proud of yourself. You just made a joke. So the pose is feminine, but here's what I'm confused about. You want female avatars. No, you demand them. But you don't want female avatars to ever hint at their gender. You want them to be exactly like the men. So why even ask for a woman? I mean, what happens if a game actually does remove all the female gender signifiers from a character? Well, you turn around and complain that it's the "I'll make a man out of you" trope. And this is a catch-22. The bar to satisfy you is impossible to meet. You have set up a no-win game. And that is one way in which you are reinforcing a tired gender stereotype.
A character's animation and movement is just as much a part of who they are as their appearance and their clothing. And like any other aspect of a character, game designers use movement to communicate information about them to the player.
Don't you think it's a little bit more than that? I mean, should we get into a discussion at this point about nonverbal communication? about how body language and tone are overwhelmingly the majority of communication? Nah, didn't think so. Let's see where you're going with this.
This isn't inherently a bad thing. Expressive character animations are just a way for the game to contribute to our understanding of who a character is and what defines them. How a character walks, jumps, even how they sit down can tell us a lot about them.
You know what? I agree. So let's see your examples and how you interpret it.
For instance, Ryu Hayabusa's precise and graceful movement conveys that he is a highly trained ninja. While the way Nathan Drake scrambles and fumbles in dangerous situations is meant to suggest that he's more of a relatable, ordinary guy who just keeps finding himself in extraordinary circumstances.
That's a little oversimplified, but so far, no disagreement.
We were almost in that.
By contrast, the way that women move in games isn't just used to suggest their confidence or their skill or some other facet of their personality. It's very often used in conjunction with other aspects of their design to make them exude sexuality for the entertainment of the presumed straight male player.
Just one little point of contention. I would say it's actually there for the female player as well. I'll get into that a bit more later, however.
What the hell?
Catwoman from the Arkham series has a deeply exaggerated hip sway when she walks. In combination with her clothing and the game's camera angles, all of this is meant to drive the player's focus to her highly sexualized butt.
You're repeating yourself a bit here, Anita, and you went over this in the butt coverings video, but let's put what you've done in this video into context and see the argument you're trying to make. You stated that these choices in animation are being made by game developers for a straight male audience. I assume you envision this is because these men just can't help but go spank it whenever they see a hot woman on the screen or something. I don't know. And you also claim that the animations are speaking about the characters specifically to essentially transform them into objects of desire for the viewing audience, as if that's the primary goal. And this is deceptive. So you pretend that the game developer made this choice on their own, and you pretend that Catwoman's sexuality isn't canon in the source material that she's drawn from. You see, Batman is a licensed property with well-established characters. Catwoman, within the context of that property, is a very sexually empowered and expressive woman. She derives strength and advantage from it. In other words, her sexuality and grace are embodiments of her agency. She is not actually reduced to an object to be acted upon. She is empowered by it. Oh no, your narrative of the subject-object dichotomy is actually smashed by your own example. And since you like to consider fictional characters as people while we're on the subject, Catwoman is in the realm of identity politics a trans feline. So, are you trying to shame otherkin?
In Resident Evil Revelations, Jill Valentine somehow manages to wiggle her whole body while she runs.
Yeah, because that animation doesn't look anything like every cop drama that I've seen on TV that has a female police officer running with a pistol.
In Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Evie Fry is a character who avoids falling into many of the sexualizing traps that some playable female characters do, but she still walks with an exaggerated hip sway.
That's an exaggerated hip sway? If you say so, I couldn't see anything past that strategic butt covering personally.
In Saints Row the Third, you can change your character's gender at any time. If you go to the clinic and swap your gender from male to female, you also come away with a newly sexualized walking animation, even though you're literally supposed to be the same character.
Yeah, because that man walking with his broad-shouldered swagger is not sexual in any way.
Male heroes are allowed to simply walk like normal human beings in ways that are average or strong or graceful or goofy.
Because you can totally tell the gender of that person inside the box, right? But here's the thing, Anita. All of those walks, well, at least the ones where you could see the men, were distinctly masculine. I mean, he wasn't walking normal. They were walking with a swagger, almost a thuggish look. If you put that walk animation on a female character, she would look like a man, not like a neutral gender person. If you were being honest, you would call it a stereotypically masculine walk. Actually, maybe the problem here is your internalized misogyny. Maybe you see men as normal instead of as being gendered too. In this way, women have to aspire to be like men. You know, it's pretty messed up.
Meanwhile, motion-captured animations for female characters often make them look as if they're walking down a runway at a fashion show in stiletto heels, even when the characters are actually in combat situations.
This one I'm gonna concede, because there's really no reason that a woman has to walk like that in any way, shape, or form. That is purely just over-exaggerated, sexualized walking. But maybe we can just chalk that up to a stylistic choice. It's certainly not the norm for games.
Watching these characters' in-game movement animations, you'd think that the director of the motion capture session directed them to walk like a model instead of a hardened space warrior.
Well, maybe for the games where they were walking like runway models, that was what they directed them to do. But the second you go a hardened space warrior, no, you didn't show any hardened space warriors walking like a model. It's another deceptive false equivalency.
Or Master Thief.
Who you're neglecting to mention is a seductress who thinks they're a cat.
Or bioterrorism agent.
Who you showed walking in stereotypical police form.
Or crime boss, or vampire, or assassin.
So some of these women walk sexually, but you still haven't shown any harm that is derived from it. Not a single statistic.
Of course, in the real world, people do walk with a sway of the hips when wearing high heels.
Actually, I find they walk with a sway of the hip generally. High heels seems to exaggerate it a little more, but no, they typically do walk with a hip sway.
If we want to get really technical about it, this slight hip sway occurs in order to maintain balance. This in and of itself is not a problem, other than generally being deeply uncomfortable.
Well, you're right in saying it's not a problem.
But it raises an important question. Why are these female characters in combat roles wearing high heels?
I'm gonna go with because they're fictional characters in fictional settings.
With all the fighting, running, and climbing these women have to do, dressing them in heels is clearly a decision rooted in sexualized aesthetic pleasure rather than believability.
Really? You're gonna now base your argument on believability and realism? I mean, never mind the fact that these women are typically running around flinging bolts of magic from their hands, or, they can be shot thousands of times and not die. I mean, that stuff I can believe, but the second it comes down to shooting people while wearing heels, that's where I draw the line. Anita, you seem to be missing the point here. This is a fantasy world. Okay? It's an escape from reality. Okay? The avatar that you are embodying is everything that you're not. Alright? They are powerful. They are sexy. They are amazing, and it allows you to escape the doldrums of your boring, ordinary looks with your hoop earrings.
In fact, animating so many female characters in games to fit into this very gendered, sexualizing walk pattern is an example of one of the ways the male gaze manifests in video games.
Ooh, now we're on to the male gaze. Alright guys, let's find out how our eyes are shooting out these dangerous beams that hurt women.
The term male gaze was coined in 1975 by feminist film critic Laura Mulvey and refers to the tendency for the visual arts to assume and be structured around a presumed masculine viewer, or in this case, player.
Because if there's any one thing throughout art history that you can learn, it's that, art hasn't ever been, established around the concept of a male viewer. I'm pretty sure that since we were back on the cave walls drawing in mud and berries, that the male audience was the intended target.
The male gaze manifests when the camera takes on a perspective of a stereotypical heterosexual man. An indisputable example of this is when the camera lingers, caresses, or pans across a woman's body, although it's not always that obvious.
Have you ever in your life read a book that wasn't about third-wave feminism? I mean, more specifically, a work of fiction? Have you ever noticed that when they introduce someone who catches the eye of a protagonist, or when the protagonist comes of age and suddenly realizes how sexy someone is that's been there the whole time, there's usually a good 2 paragraphs of poetic exposition? It's a pretty common theme, right? Now, how do you suppose you translate that to film? Yeah, I thought so. And don't pretend that this doesn't happen in every chick flick in the universe as soon as the hunky man makes his first appearance on the screen. In other words, this technique isn't gender specific. It's how you translate that type of literature into film.
In games, it can be as simple as the in-game camera resting so that a character's butt or breasts or both are center line.
And remember, that's never because the camera is focused on the character.
It can be a cutscene that rests on a woman's butt. It can be clothing that they are wearing or the way they talk. Or it can be as basic as the way a female character moves around the game world.
That last one I'm going to chalk up to that woman's thigh being broken right in the middle. Almost looks like the bone sticking out.
The male gaze reinforces the notion that man looks and the woman is looked at.
Okay, we're back to the subject-object dichotomy. I can't wait to see how she supports it in this one.
Or as art critic John Berger explains in the 1972 book Ways of Seeing, men act and women appear. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves.
A quote from an author. Interesting. And you notice the word men at the start of this isn't capitalized? That means it came out of the middle of a sentence. Let's see if we can find this quote in better context. Okay, so here it is. A woman must continually watch herself. She is almost continually accompanied by her own image of herself. Whilst she is walking across a room, or whilst she is weeping at the death of her father, she can scarcely avoid envisaging herself walking or weeping. From the earliest childhood, she has been taught and persuaded to survey herself continually, and she comes to consider the surveyor and the surveyed within her as two constituent, yet always distinct elements of her identity as a woman. She has to survey everything she is and everything she does because how she appears to men is of crucial importance for what is normally thought of as the success of her life. Her own sense of being in herself is supplanted by a sense of being appreciated as herself by another. One might simplify this by saying men act and women appear. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relationships between men and women, but also the relationship of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus, she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. So this was written by John Berger in the early 70s, and it was material that accompanied a BBC TV series titled Ways of Seeing, same as the book. It is important to keep in mind that when thinking about this quote I just read, that things were very different in the 70s. This quote is very much about female identity being valued by how she is perceived by others, specifically men. So I'm going to show you a clip from the corresponding TV show dealing directly with the quoted subject matter. John Berger himself is the man in the clip.
Could I say something there about narcissism? I think that both men and women are narcissistic, but in different senses. And I think that sometimes I have the impression that men and women are tremendously narcissistic and cut off from each other by their images of themselves, but that whereas a woman's image of herself is derived directly from other people, the mirror you're talking about, a man's image of himself is derived from the world. That is, it's the world that gives him back his image because he acts in it. And women are drawn to him as a source, as a centre of activity, and as a source of worth. I mean, since he is in the world, the fact that he values her is important. And so because they're sort of centres of narcissism are different, and the woman's is essentially only related to the other person, she's in a much more passive position than he is in relation to it.
Yes. Do you see narcissism as essentially a negative or positive phenomenon?
Well, I think that's very difficult to answer, but in the sense that it is related to identity, it's a positive phenomenon, and it seems to me that what women envy in men a lot of the time is that they have a sense of their own identity, that there is something in them which is important to them, other than simply what other people think of them. And I think that that thing is the product of their interaction with the world, that is, other things and other people. And it's almost as if through this interaction they actually build up a store of worth, a sense of themselves, which is a constant. I mean, it can't be lost. But that because the woman doesn't go out and act, she doesn't create this store. She waits only for the present interaction with a man. Mm-hmm. That can just end at any moment.
That's a lot to unpack, isn't it? I mean, first notice that she talks about man's interaction with the world as if women don't have that. And this is where you have to remember that we're talking about the early 70s. Women were just beginning to push into the workplace. And so she believes that man has built a positive self-esteem from his accomplishment. And women are lacking this. So their only sense of value was through the man that she married, right? I mean, this is where she derives her greatest sense of value. And that was objectively being measured by the opinion of men. So this is what John Berger meant when he wrote that segment of the book. And there's a simple fix, right? You get the women into the workplace so they can have that permanent fixture of self-esteem. But it's 2016, and women have been active members of industry now for 2 generations. So why hasn't that narcissism changed?
To be clear, the male gaze is not a hard and fast rule. It's a theoretical concept that is meant to help us understand the sometimes subtle and nuanced ways in which our culture influences media, and the way that media in turn can shape and reinforce existing gender dynamics in our culture.
Yeah, but not according to your quoted author. I mean, we just covered that it's about how women value themselves based on how men perceive them. Pop culture merely reflects this. And now that we've gotten this far in, I think it's time to stop and go back and address something that I mentioned that I would cover later.
The way that women move in games isn't just used to suggest their confidence or their skill or some other facet of their personality. It's very often used in conjunction with other aspects of their design to make them exude sexuality for the entertainment of the presumed straight male player.
So earlier I mentioned that this expression of sexuality is not just for the straight male player. Remember, your author mentioned that a woman is simultaneously acting while constantly aware of how she is being perceived by men. Yep. In order for a complete fantasy release, a woman needs to simultaneously be able to kick the shit out of 100 men and look sexy doing it. So it's not just for the boys, I'm afraid.
The male gaze is also not in any way limited to men or heterosexual people. Almost all of us internalize and sometimes identify with the male gaze to some extent.
And again, if you believe your quoted author, you actually have that identity deeply seated within you.
Eradicating the male gaze is not as simple as introducing an inverse female gaze that sexualizes men either. Not just because equal opportunity sexual objectification isn't the answer, but also because it isn't actually equal. One reinforces pre-existing oppressive ideas about women that are real and damaging to women in their everyday lives.
Still no statistical data that shows that this is actually harmful to you.
The other doesn't reinforce anything.
Really? It doesn't reinforce anything? I mean, look at you there. He's seriously roided out. If I was imbalanced in some way and felt I needed to compete with him, the physical dangers to my body would be immense. Not to mention the level of effort needed. I mean, to look like that man, I would need to spend 14 hours a day in the gym. And I'd probably need HGH and anabolic steroids. To look like the woman, I just need a breast implant and to lower my caloric intake. I mean, the issue here isn't unrealistic body image. The issue is your strange fixation with how important other people's opinions of you are. And we only need to turn to my favorite internet meme to show you how bullshit your argument is.
Nor are the two interchangeable. For example, when the satirical website The Hawkeye Initiative reimagines male characters in sexualized poses that are common for female characters, it isn't using the female gaze. This is just the male gaze applied to men.
Yeah, no, this is just silly. This is not the male gaze, okay, in reverse. The male gaze in reverse would be you showing a shot panning up Channing Tatum's abs.
When male characters are depicted as shirtless or wearing little clothing, like the character sometimes dubbed Hot Ryu from Street Fighter V, their lack of clothing demonstrates their power and strength, rather than depicting them as erotic playthings or reducing them to sexualized body parts.
Anita, depicting them as alpha males is sexualizing them. You are basically sending out a signal that this is a protector who's going to protect your babies and you want to breed with this person. It is sexualizing them.
The same is true when it comes to movement. Male characters get to move in ways that emphasize all sorts of characteristics and personality traits, but there's a whole world of untapped potential for representations of female characters who aren't animated in ways that frame them as sex objects, but who get to be just as stealthy or strong, swift or imposing, clumsy or graceful.
Yeah, no argument here. I mean, it's all stylistic choice, and the creator certainly has the will to do whatever they want. So, yeah, if you actually want to see this more in video games, why don't you try making one and see if it does well.
The way Ellie moves in The Last of Us communicates a sense of tension and danger, demonstrating what it's like when female characters are animated in ways that emphasize their personality and emotional state rather than serving to sexually objectify them. The path to equality and liberation does not lie in equally reducing men and women to objectified parts.
Why, Anita, do you keep coming back to Laura Croft? I mean, what did she ever do to you? Did she steal your boyfriend or something? I mean, did you dump your first boyfriend because he was more interested in playing Tomb Raider than seeing you? I mean, what happened? Why do you have so much animosity for her?
But by treating people of all genders and with all types of bodies as full and complete human beings.
Because fictional avatars in fantasy settings are full and complete human beings. Oh, thank God I got through this thing. Alright, time for a summary. The Strategic Butt Coverings video made it a point to suggest that game developers place female assets front and center to sexually gratify their male audience, and for no other reason. Male characters didn't receive such attention. This is somehow harmful to women, though in no measurable way. The solution, of course, is not to sexualize male characters, but rather to desexualize the female ones. And this video is essentially the exact same thing. Well, if you're still watching, thanks for sticking around, and I'll see y'all next time. God, I hope there isn't a next time.